legit. And today I'm really excited to have Deb and Sarah with us, who are in Madrid at COP, and they're going to be presenting to us about what's going on at COP. Before I pass it over to them, and also Kristen with Climate Generation, though, I want to just open it up and see if we have announcements from anyone else who is on the call. And I know we have a few folks that are joining us from AGU in San Francisco, so I don't know if you all have any announcements.
Hey, Reb. This is Frank Niepold at NOAA. Just a quick announcement. We have our Building Inclusive Strategies with Diverse Communities and Cities to Address Climate Change event on Friday, the Clean Workshop in partnership with AGU Friday morning. And we're really excited to continue to move our community forward and explore some new exciting opportunities here at AGU. We have good attendance already committed, so very excited about that. So we'll have to talk to the wider community after that, but just wanted to, and then all the AGU sessions really get into gear on Wednesday morning all the way through Friday afternoon. So there's a big turnout here at AGU, very exciting. And the other announcement I have is the Environmental and Climate Change Literacy Summit in LA is happening with on Wednesday night into Thursday. I'll be representing Clean there with some other leaders like Deb Morrison and Abby Rusky will also be coming down from Washington State and Madrid. So there's a lot of exciting, big strategic efforts going on in our community right now. So I just want to let others know that that's happening, and we're very excited to see how we can advance our community in the very near term.
Yeah, this is a really big week for climate and climate education and literacy.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you have the link for the Eventbrite for Friday's workshop, Frank. If you're able to put that in the chat,
I do.
That would be great.
I'll send it to somebody, and then they can put it in the chat because I don't have access to that where I am. My Wi-Fi is very weak, but I'll get it to you guys.
Okay, I can put it in the chat. I can probably dig it up.
Oh,
myself.
Cool. Thank you. Yep. Thanks, Reb.
Any other announcements?
So this is Frank Bradshaw from Portland, Oregon. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi, Frank.
Hi. Yes, just a note that will be of interest to any of the Climate Generations folks. We just had our last public gathering on Saturday for the virtual bridge to COP25. And on our opening session, one of the speakers was a former Climate Generations delegate from last year, Josie Burns, who's now over at Reed, I guess. So wanted to pass that along to you folks. She did great. She was talking about her past experience as an observer, and folks really enjoyed being able to hear about that.
Cool. If anyone was on the this call last year, Josie was one of the youth from the School of Environmental Studies that was the Clean webinar. They were a hilarious group of kids. But it's cool to hear that she's gone on and she's still, the experience was important to her.
Thanks, Frank. Any other announcements? Okay. Well, I am excited to turn it over to this week's presenters. And this is a dispatch direct from Madrid, Spain, where the 25th COP is happening. So we have Sarah Goodspeed from Climate Generation. We have Deb Morrison from University of Washington. Okay. And also Kristen Poppleton, who's Director of Programs at Climate Generation. And Kristen, I think, are you going to kick it off? Shall I pass it to you?
Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
Well, thanks for popping in today. It is one of our favorite times of year. And I am not going to talk too long because the fun part of this is all hearing from Sarah and Deb. But I wanted to open this up with a quote that I pulled from this morning's panel at COP that was focused on action for climate empowerment. And it was a high-level segment. And some of you might be aware that the entire country of Italy has just committed to making climate change education compulsory and embedded across all subject matter and grades. And the Minister of Education said these words, which I just was like, yeah, when he spoke, that education needs to no longer be seen as a secondary tool, but as one of the most disruptive, positive tools for change. And that is why our organization thinks it's important to not only send folks to the COPs every year, but to do a good job of educating others who aren't there on what these COPs are all about, and put more of a human face on it beyond the sort of wonky policy edge of all things. And so Sarah's going to talk more just about our delegation this year and what she's seeing there. And we were super lucky to talk Deb into joining her as well, because Deb has been working really closely with ECOS, which is an education-focused constituency group. She'll tell you, I'm sure, more about. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sarah, who can lead the charge. Sarah, you can tell me when to change slides.
Alrighty. Hi, everyone. This is Sarah. Hello again. I haven't been on a Clean Network call for quite a few months, but it's great to be with you all again. And so I think most of you are familiar with climate generation, so we can go quickly through that introduction. Again, we do more than education. We empower individuals and their communities to engage in solutions to climate change. So that means working across different audiences and different sectors. I am our youth and policy manager, so I work very closely with our youth program to engage students in learning how to take action and learn about advocacy and how their leadership is so important. And of course, we have our incredible educator network. We work with communities through public engagement, inspiring people to connect with their own climate stories. And we work with decision makers, including elected officials, business leaders, different folks, to help them take climate action in their own spheres of influence as well. Next. Thank you. And that's us. So again, we are extremely lucky to be here with Deb today. And I'm also here with, this is our youth delegate this year. Sabrina is our intern from Climate Generation. And we have additional delegates who I'll introduce you to later. Next. Next. So just really broadly, this event that we're at right now is hosted by the UNFCCC. So this is the body of the United Nations that comes together to create a multilateral response to climate change. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I don't think is a very effective name, but that's the one they picked. Next, please. And so the COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. And so this is COP25. It's the 25th year that they are meeting together. So every single year they'll meet in a different location around the globe to come together and assess what progress that we've made as a global community towards climate action, and create a plan to continue taking action. And Deb is going to share a lot more specifically around the education components of what that means. And so Climate Generation is our 10th year sending a delegation to the COP. So you can see we've previously sent groups of educators, multi-sector delegations, youth, business leaders, public officials, a wide range of delegates who have been able to experience these negotiations and raise their voices there as well.
So the lower picture, the man in the lower picture,
John.
yeah, so he is actually part of the Council of State Science Supervisors with, what is it? It's in the Midwest somewhere. It's one of the middle states.
He is our Minnesota state.
Minnesota. Okay.
Yeah. State. We love him very much. And he has a beautiful red jacket that he wears a lot as well.
Yeah, he loved it. He talked about it a lot.
Next, please. And so this year at COP25, I mentioned I'm here with our youth delegate, Sabrina, as well as 2 additional partners this year. We have Jen Cater from the Freshwater Society. It's another environmental nonprofit, as well as Eric Wachik from the Met Council, which is a unit of government in Minnesota, which represents our metropolitan core surrounding the Twin Cities. Next, please.
And I'll just add to that briefly too, that beyond our group, Climate Generation is sort of the convening body for anyone in Minnesota. Since the current president took office, recognizing that state level action is really important, we've done a really deliberate job of bringing those folks together. And Sarah was on a panel this morning. I just finished watching, and she did an unbelievable job, but it was a great opportunity to highlight at a super global level the importance of this super local level work. And it was sponsored through the U.S. Climate Action Center, which is paid for by We Are Still In, so which is through World Wildlife Fund.
Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, that was a great panel, and we're coordinated with more than 30 Minnesotans who are here at COP this year. A number of students this year, college students. We don't have any high schoolers this year, but other researchers, businesses, environmental activists, and many others as well.
And I had thrown this in too, not to throw you off, Sarah, but there's been some active Twitter action as usual across the board, and I wanted to highlight some of my favorites that I've been seeing out there. Really the diversity of experiences that are held and the diversity of speakers from youth panel, of course, featuring Greta, but Greta's been doing a phenomenal job of letting others step forward and speak whose voices aren't heard as often. And so this panel included Rose Whipple, who's an Indigenous leader here from the Midwest, from the Dakotas, as well as some of the other things. So just fun little bit to see a highlight of.
Thank you. So again, kind of stepping back just for context, in 2015 at COP21, they created the Paris Agreement, where almost 200 parties, which means 200 different nations in the world, agreed and signed on to the Paris Agreement in order to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And so that included targets for reducing our emissions at certain periods of time. And on the next slide, you'll see where a lot of the different emissions are currently coming from. And this reflects very much also in where some of the differences in the negotiations are also coming from, since there are a lot of different opinions on what is the best way to reduce all those emissions, and who is going to pay for it, and who is going to receive the damages from climate change, and how to balance those decisions. And the next couple slides we can skip those. It's just addressing how we're reducing emissions from those sectors, but also going into the green economy and creating a just transition. And so again, with the Paris Agreement, we have almost 200 signatories, and the US is the only nation that is now withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. And so it's a one-year process. They've recently put in their official notice. But in the meantime, the US is still a party to the Paris Agreement. So we do have negotiators who are also here, diplomats representing the US government, who are throwing their weight around in these negotiations as well. So the next few slides are just some photos so that you can all kind of get a glimpse into what this experience has been like. So I arrived after the first week of negotiations, And there are just tons of panels and events to learn about different issues and connect with other leaders and hear different models for climate solutions. This particular panel was about women in science, and it was very exciting to hear perspectives from folks from different nations on what that really looks like and how important that is for having representation in the sciences. And this was an amazing youth-led panel from the US. There's a youth group called Sustain Us, and this year they sent an all Indigenous delegation of youth who have done an incredible job. They spoke on Friday's Friday for Future March, where over 500,000 people marched through the streets of Madrid. And I wish I would have come a day early to be here for that as well, because it sounded like it was just incredible experience. And these youth led a breakout session that was filled with song and storytelling, and it was very powerful, and half the room was crying, and I'm almost feeling that even just remembering it. It was beautiful. We also, I was able to sit in on a high-level negotiation. Well, this was not a negotiation. So this photo was from, you can see the woman in the background is the president of COP25, who is the Minister of Environment from Chile. So although we're here in Madrid, Chile still holds the presidency. And so she was listening to civil society representatives. The woman in the foreground is speaking, who is representing Indigenous peoples organizations. And so even just being able to have that direct access to the top decision makers who are setting the agenda has been really powerful to witness. We also have our own network with the US Climate Action Network, who set up a meeting with the US lead negotiator and other US diplomats who are doing negotiation on behalf of the United States at this event. And so we were able to meet with her and also in a similar fashion, just share our views directly on things that we're hoping that the US will advocate for and making sure that she hears what civil society wants to come out of these negotiations. There are also some fun events. This one just wrapped up. Every single day, this is the Climate Action Network. US CAN is part of the International CAN, which has since 1999 hosted the Fossil of the Day like award ceremony, which recognizes the best of the worst. And so every day they recognize one of the parties or other actors who is getting in the way of progress in negotiations. So that is very exciting. Today's award went to Australia, who is trying to double count from previous commitments to emissions reductions. But they also have the Ray of the Day, which went to, was awarded to a man from Tuvalu, the former prime minister, in recognition of the leadership of the climate vulnerable nations. There are also unsanctioned activities. This was from last night, right outside as I was leaving COP. Extinction Rebellion had a sit-in the street right in front of the venue. You can see behind them are the flags leading into the venue. And so there was a police presence. So there's a lot of unsanctioned actions trying to call attention to other voices and make sure that folks are seeing that there's this cry for urgency to really represent our needs. Again, this was a press conference. There are all sorts of different actions inside the sanctioned area. So this was a press conference with a number of the youth who I mentioned before from Sustain Us delegation, as well as international youth from Fridays for Future. You can see Greta Thunberg is recognizable. And so this was a packed press conference, the most full of any of the events I've tried to get into. And actually we were kicked out because it was press only because it was just so popular. Other press conferences are open to everyone, but she really draws a crowd. And in this particular conference, she actually gave her time to the Indigenous youth that she was surrounded and other Fridays for Future Youth, so that their voices could be elevated. So it was very exciting to watch that. And again, this was a gentleman from Tonga. It's really a powerful experience to be able to hear from representatives from all over the world, and especially from the most vulnerable countries who are already being impacted by climate change so powerfully, and really leading on those solutions, to be able to hear their stories in their own words. I know there's a little kid, there's a surprising number of children at this event, which I love. Yeah.
So this is another picture of one of the high-level press conferences. I thought it was interesting just to be able to contrast it to some of the other things that you've already seen, and that I'll show you a few pictures from my couple days here. Again, this is one where there are all different folks from different communities represented, and it's this idea of uniting behind the science, which is one of the central messages in the Fridays for the Future, and Greta's in this one as well. So she has also been really active with the Youngo constituents here, and our colleagues in the education space of Youngo have been interacting with her regularly, so that's kind of awesome. So she's doing a really great job of helping youth elevate their voices here.
Absolutely. And then we just have a couple slides for you to continue following. As Kristen mentioned, we have social media and all sorts of ways to keep in touch and in tune with what is going on here in Madrid. And I'll turn it over to.
All right, and if you flip down a couple to 30, there you go. So I did mine mostly in pictures, so that URL probably is not going to work, so don't go there. And so go ahead, flip through them. There are some really interesting, it didn't come out very clear, but there's some really interesting things in the daily program. So I put the link in there if folks want to just check it out. You can also type UNFCCC COP25 daily program, it will probably come up. But there's some really interesting spaces around here where people gather for different press things, different webinars. It's kind of awesome. That particular sign is a great spot to do that, except it's like a crowd scene in there, so we're not there. And then another picture. I guess we had a very similar picture. Yeah. So I have you had one, I had one. I jumped in on her.
The same one from the, yeah.
So keep going. So this was a session inside the Climate Action Center, the We Are Still In space, that I thought was helpful for folks. Different people who are heads of universities. Mayor Pittsburgh was there. One of the colleagues from Washington State, who's part of she's the American Federation of Indians, I think it is, AFI. And so she's represented there. She's from the Quinault Nation. And just a panel in this one about building from the ground up. So different local-based subnational folks and what they're doing in different places. So it was there, lots of people there, but really great to hear some of that subnational work that's going on in cities and communities. Oh, that one's super little. That picture is showing the, yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. I think that
maybe
was
we can take control of the screen.
Yeah, let's
transfer very
switch
well.
over to mine. It just might have been the way that we created slides between presentations.
Perfect. So we're gonna stop sharing me and we're gonna give you power.
Okay.
Can you do that, Rob? Or can they do that?
Sweet. Thank you.
Got it?
Here we go.
Okay, go present mode. Okay, so you can see it. There you go.
Much better.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So, all right. So this one here is part of the Indigenous activity that's been here. There's local communities and Indigenous participants. And so there's the URL is there for the UN specific site that shows that work. In the picture up in one corner, I have Laura Weiland from the Omega Institute and myself. We presented this morning at the Indigenous Caucus. And it was just a fabulous space to go and listen to the work that they've been doing and trying to think about how to support them in some of the negotiation pieces today, where Laura and I were both running around doing various things to help them out. In the upper corner there is Pasang Dalma Sherpa, who is with the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development. She's out of Nepal, and she's an incredibly respected elder in the Indigenous community here, and has been a really great collaborator around education, communication, and outreach efforts in this space, and just networking with folks. Most of these folks were up all night last night working on the last part of the SB 52 negotiation pieces that lead into the COP meeting. So they were hardworking. And then you see press conferences like today. So the photo there is of the ACE focused presentation today, which drew on all this work of all these different people in the behind scenes caucuses. And that's the one that had, I believe that, yeah, that's the one where John Kerry was. And so it was a really fabulous event, but it's much more of a scripted space that goes on, and a lot of the sort of deep conversations and gritty kind of hit the groundwork is done in a lot of these other informal spaces, sort of formal/informal spaces. This is a presentation from George Marshall on one side here from Climate Outreach. That should be outreach, not outreachy, .org. And so he is out of the UK and has done a number of reports around communication, which I highly recommend people go and have a look at. He has a fabulous way of doing fairly intense research in local context. He did things like the Alberta tar sands report around how to re-message climate in a very, very conservative community of Alberta. And it was fabulous what they did. So, but he's done work all around the world, but a lot of it in Canada and the UK. And he gave a presentation inside the pavilion for the UK, and has been in all these different spaces. He sat beside me today in the ACE presentation. So great. There's also a couple other actors in this space. The Office of Climate Change Education is here, and Educate Global, which is also out of the UK, but claiming a global space. So these are organizations that we definitely should be hooking into in different ways so that we're not duplicating efforts, because I am seeing duplications in different things that are going on. And also I'll get to UNESCO in a second. So I've been really talking with folks in the Secretariat and in UNESCO and these other spaces to try and see how we can be more efficient in what we're doing, and in our lobbying efforts to get funding for what we're doing. So I wanted to just put this in front of us so that we're super clear what we're talking about, and Frank is going to be like, duh. But so this is the sort of the underlying work that sits behind the Action for Climate Empowerment. It's Article 6 of the UNFCCC framework, and it really talks about these 6 sort of key points of what we talk about when we think about education and communication and outreach efforts. So they're everything from training to public participation to actual educational activities, and all of these components are the things that we've heard a lot more talk about today. The ACE dialogue today was really centered around these pieces. It's what Italy can super stand on solid ground now and shout about how great they're doing, because they're really doing B1 very well, thinking about this idea of educational systems. But others in the space have been doing a fabulous effort too. So UNESCO was here, is here in force in different ways. And one of the people from UNESCO that I think is really like hitting it on the head is Miriam Tariq, who presented this evening in a session that I just came from. And she's working around education for sustainable development. So working with a lot of the least developed countries and trying to think about how to implement sort of A3 and 4, so public participation and training for scientific and technical and managerial personnel, as are many of the other folks who were in that space around working with business, that kind of component. So a real system of educational activity is really what we're trying to think about. And this is the kind of Frank's baby as far as I understand it. So this was the description that was for the session today, and I hyperlinked onto the top there for the actual video that's posted by the UN, if you'd like to see it, for the ACE session. It was really a fabulous collection of folks. It included youth voices from 4 different places around the world. But I do think that much of what was said in that space by Italy, by Austria, by the youth from different countries, like, was very powerful. And of course, US folks will key in on what Kerry said, but I think that many of the others, particularly Italy, I have to say, and Nicholas, who is the, I don't actually know what role Nicholas is in, I should know that, but he works for the UN, I believe. Frank, do you know? Anyway, Nicholas is a fabulous spokesman for education in the
So Deb, Nicholas is the director of the UN office to support, all actions related to the treaty, if I remember right.
See, he's the big wig in the UN. I knew it. Okay, he's lovely, and was very, very eloquent about the work of ACE. So definitely worthwhile to listen to the whole video and not just key in on Kerry.
In fact, I thought I listened to it already. I thought Kerry was the weakest point. So I would.
There you go. So there's the panel. Nicholas is the one standing at the podium there, and right next to Kerry, on not the gray-haired gentleman, the other one is the Italian education minister, who was fabulous, fabulous. So really an amazing conversation. Yeah. A couple things. We have we will post some notes on the ECOS site about some of the reports that people have. We've been meeting each day at 10 o'clock in the morning and bringing various folks into that space, and also going out into other spaces. So I had some amazing conversations today with folks like Dr. Angela Aluk, who's at York University in Canada, but she's an Indigenous woman from, I think she's Indigenous actually to one of the US states. And also second language came in handy today. I talked to several people from Morocco and from Francophone Africa about work that they're doing in those spaces, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks, and some other kind of connections around education that they really are excited about making in that space. And I always feel the need to just shout out for STEM teaching tools. We're gonna throw out a bunch more climate change related briefs coming up soon. So we've just been finalizing them for NSTA this week. I'm not sure if they will actually make it onto final draft version in the next 3 days, but we'll see, since I'm going to California in the interim. But we'll see how that goes. And I think that's it. That's all I had on mine.
Awesome. Is there questions from people for our esteemed guests? It's so cool how like clear. I mean, you're across the ocean. It's just so like you're sure. Anyone else?
There's one other thing that we didn't mention yet, which I actually thought I would bring up because it was so interesting. So 2 things. One, there are constituents. Okay, so Youngo, Ringo, which is the research collection. ECOS is a UN affiliated stakeholder community. I don't know what the other ones are, but Bingo, I don't know what that one stands for. Anyway, business. Okay, there you go. So there are all these different constituents. And so I had so much fun just randomly wandering into people's office and like seeing what happened. So like there's a local governments for sustainability, like a local government kind of constituent. And I went in there and had like a half-an-hour conversation about what local governments are doing and resources for them. And that was really interesting because we run into that a lot with different collaborations in education. And so now I know where to send people. But one of my funnest conversations was I wandered into the Canadian office because I just had to. And it turns out I ended up talking to the Canadian ACE focal point, Curtis Jenkin, who I didn't realize was actually the ACE focal point at that point. But he was lovely and sat down with me, and I was like, so about your education policy for next year, how are you writing that? And who are you asking? And so we had a really great conversation. and I got to name like many of the Indigenous colleagues and Marcy and Mackenzie and others who we've been talking to around the Canadian strategy for education. So, and I think I name dropped you too, Frank, and told them that like you should with the folks in the U.S. So yeah, so and that's really nice that those folks are pretty accessible. I don't know if you're technically supposed to wander into their offices, but it was fun.
Security, you kind of can just
I
go
know.
anywhere and meet anyone. It's amazing.
Yeah, so that was good.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions for them?
Well,
Or
this
do
is,
you-
this is, oh,
Yep.
this is Frank. This is the other Frank from Portland again. And Frank, maybe we need to have a Frank 1 and Frank 2 on these calls or something. Anyway, thank you very much. It's I miss being there, and I like hearing kind of what's on the ground. I do have one question for you. I've been watching a lot of the recordings for the side events, and I've seen an awful lot of empty rooms. Are they in fact empty rooms, or are people just sitting off to the side to stay out of the camera?
Yeah, I don't know. I've been in a lot of the side events, and it just depends. Some of them are really full, and some of them are just scattered folks. Yeah.
And a lot of people do sit on the edge because you can go in and out. Like you don't have to stay for the whole time. So a lot of folks will sit on the edge of the aisles and out of the view of the camera. I don't know, a lot of shy people around here, I guess, who don't want to sit in the front row.
Yeah.
But from what you've shown, it looks like there's been quite a bit of attendance at a lot of the other events that are not necessarily being recorded.
Yeah, and there's a number of things I didn't show. So for instance, Saturday night, I think it was, there was a party for the CAN organization, so all the NGOs, and yeah, it was an entire discotheque full of climate activists. You can imagine how crazy that was. And I left at 4 in the morning because I was tired, and apparently it shut down at 7.
Oh my God.
So, and I was up again for like things the next day at 9. And yeah, so those kinds of things turn out to be really important because there's a whole bunch of people that you know, and you meet them in all these different situations, and then they stop you in the middle of the room in like the halls and talk to you the next day. And so I actually also had a picture of like cards spread out, and we were laughing about this. So this is like what I do. Frank knows this. This is what I do when I wander around places. I like spend a lot of time talking to people in all different settings and going in and out of the country booths, and those are really beneficial conversations. And that's where a lot of the activity is happening. So even if people aren't up at the 10 o'clock in the morning sessions, there's still tons of people around here at this time of night doing a lot of things.
Hey, this is Abby. I've got a couple of questions. Hello, ladies. Nice to see you across the pond.
We've also been WhatsApping, so Abby's on the WhatsApp feed.
Yeah, I'm on the WhatsApp feed, and just really appreciating all the communication that's possible across the board with these now. One of the things I was wondering about is the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform work plan, which was adopted yesterday, I think is big news. If you guys could talk a little bit about that. And then also there's something that is on this ECOS flyer for the reception, something referred to as a digital innovation communication, or DECO. Could you talk a little bit about those two initiatives and their impact or potential impact?
Yeah, so
Thank you.
So the first one, which the acronym I'm still working on, the Indigenous Peoples Platform and Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. So that has been really being challenged by Dr. Sherpa, Pasang Sherpa, and she is a powerhouse in a very quiet, lovely, personified embodiment. Anyway, she was one of the people up until like all hours of the night working on that last night and getting the final language in. And many of the nations really lobbied to keep that language in. It's not clear if by tomorrow it will maintain in the negotiations, because several of the nations, including Saudi Arabia and some others, are sort of like, there's some politics going on around, well, but we want to put other things in there if you're going to keep human rights and indigenous rights. And people are like, really, what? And so, but basically the work that was done by the local communities and indigenous peoples platform was basically putting very positive language directly into Article 6 around human rights and indigenous rights. And the reason it's a concern for some nations is it will really make it so that oil and gas developers have to cede land rights to indigenous peoples, that environmental and climate rights are human rights and indigenous rights. So it's tying them deeply together. And as you might imagine, countries that are worried about that. Canada is a little bit worried about that too, but it still supported the motion. So yeah, so that's that one. And one of the links in the slide deck is to that specific platform. So I encourage folks to read it. And then the other one, Abby, what was it? No, it was the
Oh, it's the community. Yeah.
Digital innovations. So
Yeah.
there's a really interesting space that I've kind of just dipped my toe in. But Eileen Doolin is a little bit more versed in this space, and it's really about, there's a lot of conversations going around financing, and some of the financing conversations are about carbon credits and a bunch of stuff that I don't honestly know a lot about, but there's some innovative ideas about how to move money related to local community efforts that many of them involve ACE related targets. So education, communication, participation in different ways. And some of those are through digital innovations. So there are things like blockchain and different kinds of Bitcoin kind of operations, but through secure settings that allow for the movement of basically like a fund me type of thing, but specific to climate change. And there's a couple different versions of it that have gone on. I was at a Sunday event that was really looking deeply at that. It was like the finance community. I sat with some of the like financiers from around the world, and they tried to explain it to me. I'm like, okay. So, but it was really interesting to think about how it might basically bypass national funding mechanisms, so local communities could get grants from this like international funds that they don't have to apply for in the same way. You put in a funding proposal and you name what you're doing, you can be doing it already, and people like send money into your project, and you say how much you think you need. And so it's a really interesting mechanism to be able to fund. So that's one of the types of digital innovations. And I think, Abby, they're also starting to think about ways that we can actually share learning. So the things that you've been doing with, I want to say Greg, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. With the game changer.
Platform.
Yeah.
And that idea, I think, is what people have been talking about. But I haven't been tracking that here, so I haven't seen examples of that yet. But I know it was a question I put to UNESCO today, and they were like, we don't know. We don't have anything. I'm like, so, yeah.
Yeah, that blockchain activity is really exciting. And the two really work together. So, yeah, interesting. Thank you.
I do. Yeah, it's a part I haven't really been. I went because I was like, I don't get this. What is this? And so I went to it, and it was a crazy amount of bankers, but it was, and tech geeks, but it was really interesting.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. Does anyone else have questions? Thoughts? Any kind of question?
There's a question from Jen in the chat around, what do you think are the next steps for the clean community post COP25?
That's a good question. One of the things that I would say is there is at the ECOS morning meetings, there has been some questions about how, like a woman from Jordan this morning was asking about how they can capacity build and share webinars and learning, and how we can coordinate that really clearly. It's not just for students, but it's for teacher educators and for business professional folks. And I think that's an interesting space that has the capacity to organize around and think around potentially, or coordinate with others who are potentially doing that work. I do think Clean wants to show up big in terms of, we haven't talked about the Doha work programs, I don't think. So that's actually probably the next step in terms of timeline, is there's something called the Doha work program that goes in, and I want to say it's February 13th or February 17th. And it's basically a submission that anybody can make into the UN programs to say, this is what we'd like you to work on towards the next COP. And then many of those things are taken up at the intersessional meetings, like the SB meeting in Bonn, Germany in June. Abby went to one of those last year, so she has way more understanding of that space than I do. But then those are like where a lot of the crunchy work is done before it comes into this COP meeting. And so we really need to think as an educational community about those Doha work program submissions that are going in February, because they're the very beginning of that pipeline. And so ECOS is creating some sort of high level principles that they would love to see in those programs, no matter who's writing them. And we'll start circulating those in January. And that's coming out of a lot of the conversations here. So things like, we'd like to see education financing be a thing that's named next year. We'd like to see Indigenous rights and justice inside education. So like that kind of big principle pieces that we'd like nations to buy into as principles in their education programs. Because what we're hearing almost universally up until my last session tonight, when people said education in the space, they immediately went to schools. I asked this of the California minister who was here of education. He was like, well, I think I would do it. It's grade 6 sort of thing on climate change. I was like, dude, I'm doing that on Friday. You know, so yeah, it was just an interesting reduction down to formal schooling. And I think we need to break people of that understanding of education. That's just, we don't have time to just go through the formal system only.
And then there was also, Karen had a question or comment around bringing someone in who's been doing this work in Italy to learn about their efforts there.
Yeah, I talked a little bit with one of the aides from the Italian Minister of Education, and they're getting inundated, as might be expected since their announcement in September, with requests to share their learning. They're relatively early in what they're doing. They're not actually implementing until next September. And they have like the behind the scenes that you've not seen when the minister talks up front is the crazy spree that's going on and trying to figure out how to support the entire system to deliver climate change education next year. So that is not significant, and they realize it. So I think it will be hard to find someone to talk about it now. But I think one of the things that might be beneficial is to think, and I don't know if Abby knows any of the folks internationally who are doing that kind of work, but to think about like, who is it that wrote the policy to get that in place? Because that's more the move that needs to be now. The mechanics are something that hasn't been worked out yet.
Well, and the minister in his speech had mentioned they're actually working with Earth Day Network.
Oh, okay. That would be the folks to talk to.
Yeah, that would be a connecting point, I would think. And
Yeah.
also the pre-COP will be there next year in Italy, which I was like, ooh, I wonder, that just seems like, and I believe the young COI is going to be there, the Conference of Youth piece. So both of those things maybe.
Yes, and I did talk to them about that. That was the thing that like sparked my thought at the moment. I was like, can we come? Because I want to come.
Yeah.
And so, because I think there's a lot of sharing to be had in that space, and UNESCO is going to be there with their school work. And so, yes, I think that that's something to reach out to every and any contact that we have to be able to be at that pre-conference event in some way.
Yeah.
I also just sorry, Kristen, just to chime in a little bit about around Deb's volley around what else on the international front. And I remember there being a comment that came through from Ghana, that actually Ghana has national climate graduation requirement and curriculum, and did that before Italy, but didn't get the same international press. I don't know if you guys found out about that. And
Yes.
that, you know, in addition to our work on the Doha work plan and sort of having that organizing framework for us around the world, but also that ties into what Frank is doing with creating something that is the US work plan, education work plan, or ACE work plan, if you will, or strategy. Sort of really all this strategic work comes together now. And I think that one of the things we need to really look at is grain size. So are we at the level of principle or goals or strategies or what within that? And then have the community have avenues and vehicles for input for that to then come together and edited and you know, as a document that we can all add, documents that we can advocate for and be ready to tee up by the time of the Bonn SB 52 meeting in June. And that will then create the groundwork for COP26 in Glasgow to have a higher level reflection, if you will, of what is of the capacity around the world that's in place and that could come into place if the following were to be adhered to in the workbooks, as I understand it, or they call them playbooks or whatever, for the achievement of the nationally determined contributions. So I think to me, that's how it all sort of flows up into education having a higher profile now in the nations, in the global network of nation states that are accelerating and needing to exceedingly accelerate on climate action.
And thanks for pointing out the Ghana example, because I'd noticed that too, that Italy was getting a lot of press, but Ghana was actually the first nation that did it. I had noticed that this summer. I did talk to one of the folks from Ghana, but he was with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana. And he was really interested, not surprisingly, in education and in what was going on in Washington and the mechanics, because they're in the same situation that Italy is in, of really trying to understand how to manifest this now that they have the policy to do it. So the folks from Ghana and Italy, the Washington State Initiative, some of the stuff that's starting to happen in California and New York, like those are the places I think that are going to be these stewing grounds that going forward to the pre-conference next year and to the COP meeting, honestly, like it's gonna for the formal systems, but I think also how we do it, right? Like, do we do it as just a formal system, or do we use a formal system initiative to try and change the way we think about it, like, you know, we're trying to do? So yeah, I think all of those are questions on the board for what we do next. UNFCCC work with SDG implementation, they're really interwoven. You know, we a lot about the SDGs. It's actually kind of funny because people keep citing articles and I'm like, is that the framework or is that the SDGs? Like, because sometimes people are cross naming it, like Article 6, is that the SDG article? Is it, you know, so so there are a lot of different synergies. And one of the things that I heard tonight, which was so refreshing, because it was just getting down to the level where you're talking to people who are implementing instead of people who are just politicians, not just, but who are politicians. I'm a politician too. But what happens is that we get people who have already figured out that capacity building and education related to training and professionals is an issue. They've already worked that out because they're trying to implement the SDGs. And so they actually have functional strategies in place that they're using to educate networks. And a young person from Mexico's business community this was talking about how he has like 3,000 kind of people clusters and networks of business people that they train each other, that they work across networks, they're working with leaders in that space. And I was like, right? And so this type of system level action for empowerment is really what is happening in these spaces, but they're very disconnected. And that was the ask of UNESCO tonight, was like, is there a way that we're trying to coordinate that through the UNFCCC or the UNESCO activity or wherever? And that's what's, so that's a big ask that we need to have for next year too.
Cool. Any other questions? I have sort of a musing that I'm just always, when I'm following the uptake of education, I'm speaking from the formal sense, so in the K-12 sort of realm, around the world, and looking at these frameworks that are getting set up and these countries that are taking it full scale. I'm always so, I don't even know how to ask this as a question, but I feel like we're so behind in the US in terms of just our whole crappy denial place we're in, that the way and the needs of climate change education in the US are so different. And even through, when we think of it in like the community engagement, community education sense too. And I'm wondering, I mean, you don't have to answer either of you, because I don't even know what the question is.
I'm
But
gonna
like,
ask a question.
yeah.
Yeah, my question would be, why are we even bothering with the climate deniers? Like, why aren't we just focusing on those who are adjacent? You know, the middle conservatives who likely see climate change happening in their communities and want to do something about it, and working them, maybe not naming it as climate change initially, but naming it as like, what is it that you see changing in your lands and waters and your economic activity that you want to go forward and shift with? Because I think SDGs are a good place to start, because there's a lot of things that we can focus on as like interest convergent points that we can build from. And at this point, I'm not willing to spend my effort with climate deniers. I really want to just see action on the ground and changes. So networks, you know, the working with networks to educate them, yes. Working with individuals or like the general public in this space, I think only if they're actually doing something in activity, like working around solution-centered activity.
Awesome.
Hey, Kristen.
So what you're saying, oh, go ahead.
Just one quick point, though. I think you've got a great question or comment there, but I think, you know, one of the things as we begin to prepare for some more strategic initiatives in the United States is, I think the landscape of work, I don't think we fully understand how much great work is going on in our country.
I know.
Related to ACE. I think there's way more that is happening than we're fully appreciating, aware of, and collaborating with.
I think my question was not so much that, I mean, I agree. I think there's amazing things. I'm thinking more on an international level. At what level can we learn from other places? Simply because of the environment that exists in this country.
The UK.
Yeah.
The UK is a great example. They have not been wholly on board as a population, and yet they have some great strategies that they have moved forward with to try and like move the population. Because what you do need, Kristen, not to minimize like that we shouldn't do climate deniers, but like what we do need is we need enough political will to engage in activity that is government level activity like carbon tax or whatever. I seriously don't totally understand. But what we do need is we need enough public engagement or understanding that these things are important, and when they come on the ballot, we should vote for them. And so that level of engagement, I think, is what we need to work towards. And I really encourage you to take a look at some of George Marshall's work really deeply around climate communication. So it's climateoutreach.org, because they have just dug into the cultural aspects of language and messaging in ways to not create polarizing, which I think has really been America's challenge. And so to use the methods that have been used against us in ways that are going to build this community better.
Great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and these guys probably need to go to bed.
Not 4 a.m. yet.
That's right. You're at 4 a.m. So.
Deb and Sarah, thank you so much. And Kristen, thank you too. Always so great to have a direct line into COP and like really hear what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. And look forward to seeing Frank and Abby tomorrow night.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super excited. Thanks for the extra travel to from Madrid to LA.
Great. All got worked out. All right.
Safe travels.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks, Deb and Sarah. Thanks,
Thanks,
Kristen.
Thank
Bye.
you.